The first time Susanna Boone laid eyes on Clark Ellsworth, he was pinning a man twice his size against the wall of the Silver Star Saloon with nothing but one forearm and a look cold enough to freeze the Rio Grande in July. And every soul on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, stopped walking to stare. That was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell was a town that had seen its share of hard men. Situated just north of the Cherokee Strip along the Kishom Trail, it received the cattle drives from Texas every season, bringing with them dust and money and trouble in equal measure. The drovers came in rowdy and sunburned, their pockets full of trail wages they were eager to spend. The town accommodated them with saloons and gambling dens, and a general rowdiness that had earned Caldwell the unofficial title of the Queen of the Border. But even in a town like that, even in a place where violence was as common as the red dirt underfoot, there was one name that carried a particular weight, a name spoken in low tones or sometimes not spoken at all, just nodded toward, just referenced with a tilt of the chin and a drop of the voice. Clark Ellsworth. He was the foreman of the Rocking E Ranch, which sprawled across nearly 12,000 acres northeast of town, and belonged to a man named Gerald Hargrove, who was mostly absent and largely drunk. The ranch ran some of the finest longhorn cattle in the territory, and it was Clark who kept it running. It was Clark who rode out in the dark before dawn when a fence came down and the herd scattered. It was Clark who paid the hands their wages fairly, who handled the cattle buyers without flinching, who had once ridden alone into a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights, and come back with a signed agreement and a split lip, and never once mentioned what had happened in between. He was 29 years old, and he had the eyes of a man who had seen twice that many years' worth of difficulty. Those eyes were the color of storm clouds over the prairie, gray with a suggestion of blue underneath, like the sky before it decides what kind of weather it intends to deliver. The ranch hands at the Rocking E did not cross him. They respected him the way men respect a force of nature, not because they wanted to necessarily, but because the alternative was unthinkable. He was fair, they all agreed on that. He was not cruel. But there was something about Clark Ellsworth that made a man think twice, then 3 times, before saying something foolish in his presence. It was partly his size. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulder, with hands that had pulled calves and mended wire and hauled water until they were more like tools than hands. But it was mostly the stillness, the way he could stand in the middle of a commotion and be the calmest thing in it, the way he never reached for his revolver in a hurry because the reaching was never necessary. Most men, when they saw Clark Ellsworth set his jaw and fix his gaze on them, reconsidered whatever it was they had been about to do. So when Susanna Boone walked into that same territory in June of 1878, riding on the bench seat of a buckboard wagon beside her father, Amos Boone, who had just purchased the old Latimer property on the western edge of the Rocking E's grazing range, the last thing anyone in Caldwell expected was for the story of Clark Ellsworth to take the particular turn it did. Susanna was 24 years old, and she had come from Wichita, where her father had run a hardware store for 16 years before selling it, and deciding that the next chapter of his life would involve cattle and open land instead of hinges and nails. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up in a practical bun when she was working, which was most of the time, and brown eyes that were warm and direct in equal measure. She was not a woman who looked away when something needed examining. She had grown up watching her mother manage a household and a business and 2 younger brothers simultaneously, and she had absorbed from that example a certain efficiency of action, a habit of identifying what needed doing and doing it without excessive deliberation. She was also, it must be said, entirely unaware of the legend of Clark Ellsworth when she sat down across from him at the long table in the Rocking E's cookhouse on the second Sunday after her family's arrival. The meeting came about because Gerald Hargrove, for all his faults, maintained the old frontier custom of welcoming new neighbors, And so he had sent word to Amos Boone that the rocking E would be pleased to have the Boones for Sunday supper. Hargrove himself appeared briefly, shook Amos's hand, made several vague pronouncements about the quality of the territory, and then excused himself with the explanation that he had correspondence to attend to, which everyone present understood to mean a bottle of rye whiskey in his private study. That left Susanna and her father seated at the cookhouse table with the rocking E's foreman and a half-dozen of the senior ranch hands. The cookhouse was a long, low-ceilinged room with a massive iron stove at one end and rough-hewn tables running the length of it. The cook, a stout Mexican man named Ramon who had been feeding cowboys for 20 years and had opinions about everything, had prepared a supper of roasted beef and baked beans and cornbread, and a pot of stewed tomatoes that was better than anything Susanna had eaten since leaving Wichita. She was genuinely hungry after the week of hard work that had gone into getting the Boone homestead to a state of basic functionality, and she ate with the kind of appetite that a person earns through honest physical labor. The ranch hands were polite, if uncertain. They were men accustomed to their own company and not entirely sure how to conduct themselves at a table with a young woman present. They sat straighter than usual and spoke more carefully, and several of them had made visible, if not entirely successful, attempts to clean the trail dust from their hands and faces. Clark Ellsworth sat at the head of the table because that was where the foreman always sat, and he ate his supper the way he did everything else, quietly, attentively, without waste. He had spoken a few words of welcome to Amos Boone, assessed the older man with a steady gaze, and apparently concluded that Amos was a decent sort who meant what he said and worked hard. He had glanced at Susanna when she sat down, offered a brief, correct nod, and returned to his plate. He was halfway through his second helping of stewed tomatoes when Susanna reached for the salt cellar, found it empty, and noticed that the full one was sitting directly in front of Clark Ellsworth's right hand. She looked up at him. He had not yet noticed her looking. His attention was on something Amos was saying about the condition of the fencing on the south pasture of the Latimer property, and there was a small crease between his brows that suggested he was genuinely considering the problem. "Mr. Ellsworth," Susanna said, her voice pleasant and perfectly ordinary, the way a person speaks to another person at a dinner table, "would you pass the salt, please?" What happened next was the thing that would be retold, with increasing embellishment, in every bunkhouse and saloon between Caldwell and the Texas line for the next 3 years. Clark Ellsworth turned to look at her. She met his gaze with the same warm, direct attention she gave to everything, as if asking him to pass the salt were the most natural thing in the world, as if he were simply a man at a table and she simply a woman at the same table, and there were nothing remarkable about either of them or the exchange between them. He reached for the salt cellar. He picked it up. It slipped. Clark Ellsworth, the man who had once disarmed a pistolero in a dark alley without breaking a sweat, who had roped a running longhorn from horseback in a thunderstorm, whose hands never trembled under any circumstances that anyone had ever witnessed, fumbled the salt cellar, caught it awkwardly with his other hand before it hit the table, and then held it out to her with an expression of such transparent and bewildered consternation that 2 of the ranch hands on the opposite end of the table had to look down at their plates to avoid laughing. Susanna took the salt cellar with a small smile, salted her tomatoes, and set it back on the table between them. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her supper as if nothing had happened. Clark Ellsworth said nothing for the next 4 minutes. Amos Boone, who had not been watching and had missed the whole thing, continued talking about fencing. The ranch hands ate their cornbread with great concentration. Ramon, who had been watching from the vicinity of the stove, turned back to his pots with a private expression of profound satisfaction. That night, after the Boones had climbed back into their buckboard and driven home under a sky full of stars, Hector Vane, who was the youngest of the rocking hands and therefore the bravest when it came to saying things that others were thinking, leaned over to the man beside him in the bunkhouse and said in a voice just above a whisper, "Did you see that? She just asked him like he was anybody. And he nearly dropped the salt," the other man replied, equally quiet, equally awed. "I've seen that man catch a rattlesnake with his bare hands," Hector said. "He nearly dropped the salt." The story spread the way all good stories do, person by person, each retelling adding a little color, until by the time it reached the far pastures it had become a tale of Clark Ellsworth knocking over the entire table in his astonishment. The truth was simpler and, in its way, more remarkable. Clark Ellsworth had been rendered briefly, uncharacteristically clumsy by a woman with brown eyes who had looked at him as if he were just a person. He lay awake that night in his quarters, which were a small room off the main barn, separate from the bunkhouse, as befitted a foreman. He stared at the ceiling and considered with some irritation the fact that his hands had betrayed him. He was a man who prided himself on his composure, and composure was exactly what he had failed to demonstrate in the 30 seconds following the phrase, "Would you pass the salt?" He turned the irritation over, examining it, and found underneath it something else entirely, a sort of warmth, unfamiliar, like the feeling you get when you walk inside from the cold and the fire in the hearth is already built up and the room is bright. He did not analyze it further. He was not, by nature, a man who spent a great deal of time analyzing his feelings. He got up before dawn as always, saddled his horse as always, and rode out to check the east pasture fence as always. But his thoughts kept drifting, with a persistence that he found both annoying and interesting, back to brown eyes and a simple, direct request. Susanna, for her part, had noted that the foreman of the rocking was both impressively capable-looking and unexpectedly unsettled by a request to pass the salt. She had found this second quality rather endearing, though she would not have said so aloud. She had been in the territory less than 2 weeks and she had more immediate concerns. The condition of the well on their property, which needed new casing, the state of the barn roof, which needed several boards replaced, and the general challenge of establishing a working ranch from a property that had been left largely untended for 18 months. These concerns occupied her fully for the next several weeks. Amos Boone was a capable man with a willing spirit but an aging back that made the physical work slow going, and Susanna threw herself into the labor alongside him with the same energy she had applied to everything since childhood. She learned quickly. She had always learned quickly. By the end of July, she could identify the signs of pink eye in cattle from 50 yards and knew the difference between a fence post that needed resetting and one that needed replacing entirely. It was this competence that brought Clark Ellsworth back to the Boone property on a Tuesday morning in late July, when he arrived at their gate with 2 of his hands and a wagon full of post timber. Susanna was in the yard mending harness when they rode up, and she shielded her eyes against the morning sun to look at them. Clark touched the brim of his hat. She noticed he held her gaze steadily this time, with none of the fumbling of the dinner table. He had apparently decided on a different approach. "Your south fence is down in 3 places," he said. "Our herds share a boundary line. I thought we'd fix it together." "That's kind of you," she said, setting down the harness. "My father is in the east pasture. I'll show you where the worst sections are." They rode out together along the fence line, Clark in his 2 hands, and Susanna on the sturdy gray mare she had named Adelaide for reasons she never fully explained. It was the first time they were in each other's company, without a table full of people between them, and both of them were aware of it with a degree of awareness that they each took pains not to show. Clark's 2 hands were named Pete Garza and Sam Whitmore. Pete was about 40, weathered and silent, who communicated primarily through the efficient use of tools. Sam was younger, mid-20s, talkative in the way that people are when they are nervous, and he kept up a running commentary about the fence posts and the grass condition and the weather forecast as predicted by the pain in his left knee, which had been injured in a riding accident 2 years prior. Susanna matched Clark's pace on Adelaide, and they rode ahead of the others, which meant they had a few minutes of relative privacy as they covered the ground between the first and second broken sections of fence. Clark studied the pasture. He had a way of looking at land that was professional and respectful at once, as if the land itself were someone he was taking seriously. "You've been making improvements," he said. It was not a question. He could see the evidence of new work along the north boundary, the cleared brush near the stream, the fresh boards on the barn visible from here. "There was a lot to do," she said simply. "Still is." "You're not what Hargrove expected," he said, and then seemed to immediately reconsider whether he had meant to say that out loud. She glanced at him. "What did he expect?" "A beat. He told me your father was bringing a daughter who would need looking after." He paused again. "I'm revising that opinion." Susanna looked straight ahead at the broken fence section in the middle distance. She was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding how to respond to something that has pleased them more than they intend to let on. "I've been looking after myself and my father since my mother died 6 years ago," she said. "I don't mind help. I just don't require management." Clark looked at her. Something in the line of his jaw softened almost imperceptibly. "Noted," he said. They fixed the 3 fence sections over the course of the morning. Amos Boone joined them from the east pasture, and he and Clark had a long conversation about cattle management that was substantive and mutually respectful, the kind of conversation that happens between two people who both actually know what they are talking about. Susanna worked alongside Pete, who turned out to be excellent company once she accepted that his communication style was purely gestural, and together they set 2 new posts that were plumb and solid and would last a decade. Ramon had sent lunch in the wagon, a cloth-covered basket of tortillas and cold beef, and a jar of pickled peppers, and they all sat in the shade of a cottonwood by the fence line to eat. Clark sat across from Susanna, and when Amos asked him a question about the Kishom Trail drive schedule for the fall, he answered it thoroughly, but his attention kept sliding back to her with the same slight, controlled quality it had had since she first noticed him. She handed him the jar of pickled peppers when she was finished with them. Their fingers did not touch. But they were close, and both of them registered the closeness with a precision that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with attention. "The Latimer well," he said after a moment. "What's the state of it?" "The casing's rotted," she said. "We've been hauling water from the stream." "It's manageable but not ideal." "I know a man in town who does well work," Clark said. "Good one. Goes by the name of Tobias Finn. He's honest with his pricing and he knows what he's doing." He paused. "I could bring him out if you want." Susanna looked at him for a moment. There was nothing in his expression that was presumptuous. He was not offering because he thought she couldn't manage it herself. He was offering because he knew something useful and he thought it might help, the way you hand someone a tool they don't have when they're clearly working at a task. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded once and went back to his tortilla. Tobias Finn came the following Friday, recommended by Clark, and fixed the well casing in 2 days for a price that was fair. He also, while he was there, mentioned to Amos that there was a cattle buyers' meeting in Caldwell the following Wednesday where several Texas buyers would be present, and that if Boone had any stock to discuss, it was worth attending. Amos went to the meeting and came back with a handshake deal that would sell off their first small herd in October and bring in enough to cover the costs of the repairs they had made and then some. These things were not accidents. Susanna understood that Clark Ellsworth was quietly, without fanfare, making sure the Boone operation did not fail. She did not know exactly why he was doing it, or she did know but had not yet put the knowing into words, even to herself. She thought about it one evening sitting on the front step of the Boone house, watching the last of the sunset drain out of the western sky in shades of orange and deep rose. The prairie was wide and still and smelled of dry grass and the faint sweetness of sage. Somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called and was answered. Susanna sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the way Clark Ellsworth listened when she spoke, not waiting for his turn, but actually listening, tracking what she said with those storm-gray eyes. And she felt the warmth of it like the warmth of Ramon's cookhouse fire. She was 24 years old and she had not been a romantic person, generally speaking. There had been a young man in Wichita, a banker's son named William, who had come calling twice before she decided that the effort of pretending to be less capable than she was in order to make him feel comfortable was not worth the candle. She had told him this in somewhat different words, and William had been confused and then offended and then gone, and Susanna had returned to the hardware store and thought no more about it. Clark Ellsworth did not make her want to be less capable. He seemed, in fact, to find her capability interesting, almost novel, the way a person finds something they have heard described but never actually seen. She did not fully understand his interest yet, but she felt it the way you feel a change in the wind before you see any evidence of it. He came back to the Boone property 2 weeks later with the ostensible reason of returning a wagon jack that Amos had lent to the rocking. The wagon jack could have been returned by any of the hands. Clark brought it himself. He found Susanna in the barn working on Adelaide's left front shoe, which had thrown a nail. She was crouched over the mare's hoof with a rasp, and she looked up when she heard his boots on the barn floor. "The wagon jack," he said, holding it up unnecessarily. "Set it by the wall," she said. "I'll be done in a minute." He set it by the wall and then, rather than leaving, crouched down beside her and looked at the shoe. He did not offer to take over. He looked at what she was doing with the professional attention he gave to all things that involved the care of animals, and after a moment he said, "You've got the angle a little steep on the near side." She looked. He was right. She adjusted the rasp. He watched without comment as she made the correction. "Where did you learn to shoe?" he asked. "My father taught me the basics. I've been refining it." She finished with the rasp and set the hoof down. Adelaide stepped once and stood steady. Susanna stood up and pushed a loose strand of hair back from her face, and found that he had also stood up and was standing about 3 feet away, watching her. This time neither of them looked away for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. "I need to ask you something," Clark said. His voice had a quality it had not had during their previous encounters, slightly more careful, the way a man is careful when he is saying something he has been considering for longer than the immediate moment would suggest. Susanna waited. "We're short-handed for the fall drive," he said. "We've had 2 men leave. One went back to Texas. One broke his wrist. I know your father has stock going south with the buyers in October. If you wanted to ride along with our outfit as far as the territory line, we could use the extra hands. And it would save you the cost of hiring independent drovers for your cattle." He paused. "It's your decision." Susanna thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "I'll talk to my father tonight," she said. "But yes, most likely yes." The corner of Clark's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that lived just before a smile, the territory a smile comes from when it is building. "All right," he said. He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the barn gate post, settled it on his head, and walked back out to his horse. Susanna stood in the barn door and watched him ride away, and thought that a man who could move like that, with that particular quality of purpose and stillness combined, was either very comfortable with himself or very focused on where he was going. Probably both. She talked to her father that night. Amos, who had been watching the situation with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood exactly what was developing, even if neither of the parties involved was quite ready to name it, agreed immediately. "Ellsworth's a good man," he said over his supper. "Straight, works hard." "I know," Susanna said. Amos looked at her. "Be a good arrangement," he said carefully, meaning several things at once. Susanna gave him a look that mothers give children who are being too clever. "I'll pack my gear," she said. The fall drive began on the 5th of October under skies that were the deep, saturated blue of autumn on the southern Kansas plains. The Rocking E drove 600 head of longhorns, and the Boone cattle, all 42 of them, A modest but sound starter herd went along as a secondary contingent under the same trail boss authority. Clark rode point. Susanna rode swing on the right flank, which was where the work was hardest, and she had asked for that position, and Clark had given it to her without debate. The first day on the trail she proved, without attempting to prove anything, that she could handle cattle. She had a natural instinct for reading the herd's mood, for anticipating the moment before a steer decided to bolt and addressing it before it became a problem. The hands who had been skeptical, and several had been, in the quiet way of men who maintain opinions without voicing them, revised their assessments by noon. Hector Vane rode up beside her in the late afternoon, when the herd was moving well and the work was straightforward. He was young and open-faced, and had an honest quality that Susanna liked immediately. "You're pretty good at this," he said, with an air of mild astonishment. "Thank you," she said. "Clark said you would be," Hector added, and then seemed to realize he had revealed something and looked ahead at the herd with sudden intense interest. Susanna filed this away and said nothing. That evening they made camp on a flat near a shallow creek, and Ramon, who had come along as trail cook, which was standard on Rocking E drives, produced a supper of beef stew and sourdough biscuits from a chuckwagon that he operated with the total territorial authority of a general managing a campaign. The hands ate gratefully and loudly, and then drifted to their bedrolls. Clark found Susanna standing a little apart from the camp, looking out at the dark prairie. The fire behind her threw long shadows toward the grass. He came to stand beside her, not quite close, but closer than a strictly professional exchange would require. "First day went well," he said. "It did," she agreed. They stood together in the quiet for a moment. Above them, the Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon in a great pale river of light that you could only see this way in country this dark, this wide. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that grows between people who have passed the stage of needing words to fill every space. "Can I ask you something?" Susanna said, looking up at the stars. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Why did you help us when we first arrived? The fence, the well-manned, the cattle buyers' meeting." He was quiet for a moment. "You were new to the territory. Your land borders mine. It made sense to help your operation get established." She looked at him. He was looking at the prairie. "That's the practical reason," she said. "Is there another one?" A long pause. The coyotes called in the distance again. The fire crackled. Somewhere a horse moved in the picket line. "I suppose there is," he said. That was all he said. But the way he said it was its own kind of answer, and Susanna turned back to the stars with the warmth in her chest grown larger and more settled, like a fire that has caught properly and will not go out. The drive took 11 days to reach the territory line, where the buyers were meeting a larger gather of cattle from multiple ranches. The work was hard and honest, and Susanna loved it with the part of herself that had always needed to be useful and capable and moving forward in the world. She learned the particular rhythms of trail life: the pre-dawn start, the hours of steady riding, the midday rest when the heat peaked, the afternoon push, the evening camp. She learned which hands were good company and which were better left to their own thoughts. She learned that Pete Garza sang quietly to himself in Spanish when he thought no one was listening, and that it was actually very good. She and Clark fell into a pattern on the drive that was, on the surface, entirely professional. They discussed the cattle, the terrain, the weather, the condition of the trail. He deferred to her judgment when she had information he lacked. She deferred to his when the reverse was true. It was a clean, mutual exchange that had a different quality than most working relationships, because underneath it, running like a current under clear water, was the ongoing fact of their awareness of each other. On the 6th night, they were camped near a stand of cottonwoods by a river whose name Susanna did not know, and Clark sat across the fire from her for the better part of an hour after supper, talking about the territory. Not making conversation, actually talking, telling her about the changes he had seen since he had come to Kansas 8 years earlier, the way the cattle trade had changed, the way the towns had grown, The way the land itself looked different from season to season with the grazing patterns. He talked about it with a love for the place that he did not seem aware he was showing, and Susanna watched the firelight on his face and listened. "You love this country," she said, when he had been quiet for a moment. He considered this. "I don't know if I love it," he said. "I know I couldn't leave it." "That might be the same thing," she said. He looked at her across the fire with that look that had been building since the dinner table and the salt cellar, not a look she could entirely name, but one she was coming to know the shape of. "What about you?" he said. "Wichita was home. This is harder country." "Wichita was where I grew up," she said. "I'm not sure it was ever quite home." She paused, looking into the fire. "Home is something you build, I think, not just something you find." He was quiet. Then, with a care that suggested he had chosen the words precisely, "That's a good way to look at it." They sat there a while longer before the need for sleep took the camp fully, and neither of them moved to end the evening first. And when Susanna finally said good night and went to her bedroll, she lay there under the enormous Kansas sky and felt the territory settle around her like something that was beginning, after 6 months, to feel like exactly what she had said, home being built. Board by board and acre by acre and conversation by conversation. The sale at the territory line went well. The Boone cattle sold at a fair price, and Clark negotiated the rocking ease portion of the sale with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it many times and knew exactly what fair market value looked like, and was not interested in accepting anything less. The buyers, who were a mixed group of Texas cattlemen and Kansas speculators, treated Susanna with varying degrees of surprise and adjustment when they realized she was a rancher in her own right, and not simply Amos Boone's decorative accompaniment, and she handled their adjustment with the same practical directness she applied to everything. One of the buyers, a broad, red-faced man from Abilene named Horace Kells, made the mistake of directing all his comments to Clark rather than to her when discussing the Boone cattle, despite the fact that she was the one standing in front of the herd with the paperwork. Clark let this go on for approximately 90 seconds and then said, very quietly, "You're talking to the wrong person, Horace. These are Miss Boone's cattle and her transaction." Kells looked at Clark, then at Susanna, and made the recalibration that was required. Susanna completed the sale without drama. Clark said nothing more about it, but as they walked back to the camp afterward, she felt the solid fact of it alongside her, and thought that a man who did things like that without needing to be asked was a particular kind of man. On the way back north, the drive lightened, no more cattle to manage, just the hands riding home with pay in their pockets and the satisfaction of work done. The mood was easier, and the evenings were longer, and the conversations around the fire went further in the direction of friendship and ease, and the small revelations that come when people have spent enough time together in hard conditions to stop being guarded. On the 9th night of the return journey, 3 days from Caldwell, it rained. A real rain, not the afternoon thunderstorm variety, but the steady, gray, soaking kind that the plains deliver in October, when the seasons are changing and the sky comes down close, and everything smells of wet grass and mud. The hands sheltered under the chuckwagon and under the cottonwoods, cursing good-naturedly. Ramon produced hot coffee at a rate that suggested he had been planning for this. Susanna and Clark ended up sheltering under an overhang of limestone near the creek bank, standing side by side with the rain coming down in a gray curtain in front of them, and the warmth of the rock behind them and the coffee in their hands hot against their palms. "I was going to tell you something," Clark said. He was looking at the rain. His voice had that careful quality again. The one she had learned meant he was about to say something he had thought about for a while. She waited, looking at the rain with him. "I've been in this territory 8 years," he said. "I've worked for Hargrove since I was 21. I've been the foreman since I was 24. In all that time I've never," he stopped, started again. "There have not been a great many people who have," he stopped again. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his face that was entirely different from the composed, unreadable stillness she had come to know. "I find your company very good," he said finally, which was a man who did not have easy access to poetry, trying to say something true by the most direct road he could find to it. Susanna looked at him for a long moment. The rain came down. The horses moved on the picket line. The coffee was warm between her hands. "I find yours very good too," she said, which was equally direct and entirely sincere. He looked at her for another moment, and then, slowly, as if he were doing something he was afraid of getting wrong, he reached up and pushed a wet strand of hair back from her face with the tips of his fingers. His touch was gentle, tentative, nothing like the strength she knew he was capable of, the careful opposite of it. She felt it down to the center of her chest. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, with a trace of that almost smile, "I should probably tell you that I nearly dropped the salt." Susanna laughed genuinely brightly, the kind of laughter that belongs to a specific, particular joy. "I noticed," she said. "The whole territory knows," he said, and there was something rueful and fond in his voice that she had not heard before. "Good," she said, and she was smiling, and he was looking at her as if the smile were something he intended to remember. And the rain came down around them in the dark, and the world outside their overhang of limestone was entirely wet and cold, and entirely inconsequential. They rode back into Caldwell 2 days later in the slant light of an October afternoon. The town received them with its usual indifference. The cattle trade was ordinary business, and returning trail crews barely merited a glance from the merchants and townspeople going about their day. But Susanna noticed that several of the ranch hands, as they split off toward the rocking E, exchanged glances that were not entirely about trail business. Hector Vane caught her eye as he rode past and tipped his hat with an expression of absolute innocence that was not convincing at all. Amos Boone met them at the gate of the Boone property, and he looked at his daughter and then at Clark Ellsworth and said, "Good drive." "Very good," Susanna said. "Sold well," Clark confirmed. Amos looked between them again with his quiet, knowing look. "You'll stay for supper, Mr. Ellsworth," he said. It was not quite a question. Clark looked at Susanna. She looked at him. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." October became November. The territory shifted into the quieter rhythms of late autumn. The cattle settled in their winter pastures. The trail drives done until spring. The days shorter and colder, and filled with the maintenance work that kept a ranch functional through the hard months. Clark's visits to the Boone property became a regular feature of the week. They rode fence together sometimes, or he stopped by in the evenings after the day's work was done at the rocking E, and he sat across the kitchen table from Susanna while Amos smoked his pipe by the fire and pretended not to notice. They talked about everything. She told him about growing up in Wichita, about her mother, who had been a remarkable woman who died of fever when Susanna was 18, and whose absence had made the world feel smaller for a long time. He told her about coming west from Missouri at 21 with $40 and a good horse, and the conviction that there was more room in the world than the farm he had grown up on had allowed. He told her about his first years in the territory, the roughness of it, the beauty of it, the way you could go a whole day without seeing another person, and find that the solitude was something you had been missing without knowing it. He did not talk much about the reputation he had, the fear the ranch hands had for him, the way men in the saloons would give him a wide berth. He wore it the way a man wears a coat he has had for so long he has forgotten it is there. But she asked him about it once directly, as she asked about most things directly. "People in town talk about you in a particular way," she said. They were riding along the northern boundary of her property in the thin, cold light of a November afternoon. "Like you're something to be wary of." He was quiet for a moment. "I've had to be capable of things that made wariness useful," he said. "Early on, this wasn't always a settled country. And now." He considered. The capability doesn't go away just because the country settles. A pause. But what people are afraid of is usually the idea of a thing, not the thing itself. "I've never been what they think I am." "What are you then?" she asked, and her voice was quiet and genuinely curious and not at all challenging. He looked at her. "I'm a man who works cattle and fixes fences and nearly drops salt cellars," he said. She smiled. He smiled back, and it was the full version this time, the one that transformed his face entirely, and she thought that this was something very few people had probably seen, and she was glad to be among those few. They were in love by November. Both of them knew it, and neither of them had yet said it, in the way that people sometimes hold the knowledge of something good a little carefully before speaking it, like holding a lamp in both hands in the wind. But the shape of it was visible in everything they did. The way Clark would arrive at the Boone property, and his whole aspect would shift slightly, something in him settling and brightening at once. The way Susanna watched for his horse on the road in the evenings, with an attention that had nothing to do with practical necessity. Amos Boone was both fully aware of all of this and actively enjoying it in the fond, unobtrusive way of a father who loves his daughter enough to let her find her own way. He had taken to retiring to bed at a noticeably early hour on the evenings Clark visited. On a Friday evening in late November, after Amos had done his early retirement and the kitchen was warm with the stove's heat, and the two of them were sitting with cups of coffee across the table from each other, Clark said, "I need to ask you something." "You said that once before," she said. "I know," he said. "This is a different question." She set her cup down. She looked at him steadily and felt the warmth in her chest that was always there now in his presence, large and settled and entirely certain. "I'd like to court you formally," he said. "If you're willing, I'd like to speak to your father." Susanna looked at him for a long moment. She could see the effort it had taken him to say it plainly, not because he was uncertain of what he wanted, but because he was a man who had spent years keeping his interior life very private, and making it visible even to someone he trusted was an act of genuine courage for him. She understood this about him, and she was moved by it. "My father already knows," she said. "He'll give you his blessing before you finish asking." The corner of his mouth moved. "That confident." "He went to bed at 8 o'clock, she said. "He's been going to bed at 8 o'clock on the evenings you visit for 3 weeks. Clark looked down at the table, and there was a low, quiet sound from him that she had not heard before. He was actually laughing, a real laugh, and it did something to her that she had not anticipated, the surprise of it, the rare beauty of it. "I should probably still ask him properly," Clark said. "Yes," she agreed. "Tomorrow morning." He asked Amos the next morning, standing in the yard in the thin winter sunlight with his hat in his hands and a directness and respect that made Amos Boone grip his hand firmly and say, "I've been hoping you'd get around to asking." He paused, then added, with the particular pleasure of a man who has been watching something good develop, "She's been hoping the same, though she wouldn't say so." Clark rode back to the rocking with his hat back on and the cold air against his face, and the feeling in his chest that had no adequate word for it, except that it was the opposite of every kind of cold. The winter months that followed were some of the best of Susanna's life. The courtship was formal in the ways that the time required. Clark was always correct, always respectful of her father's presence and the proper forms. But it was also deeply, genuinely personal in the way that two people who have already become each other's chosen company inevitably are. They rode together and worked together and talked for hours about everything. He brought her things he thought she would find interesting. A book of natural history he had found in Caldwell's small dry goods store, a piece of worked silver jewelry from a craftsman who had come through on his way west, the first flowers of the early spring when the season finally began to turn. She taught him, she discovered, some things as well. She was more at ease in company than he was, better at the small social currencies of town life, better at reading the emotional undercurrents of a room. In Caldwell, when they went to town together, she would sometimes quietly point out things he had missed. The reason a particular merchant was treating them coolly, the social dynamics of a gathering that were invisible to him but that she tracked naturally. He listened and absorbed and did not feel diminished by not having seen it himself, which she found endlessly refreshing. There was one evening in February when they attended a dance in Caldwell at the town meeting hall. It was a modest affair, a fiddle player and an accordion and a plank floor, and about 40 people in their best clothes. But it was the social event of the winter and everyone came. Several of the rocking hands were there, and Susanna noticed the way they watched Clark move through the room with a new quality to their watching, not the old wariness, but something warmer, more affectionate, as if his association with Susanna had made him legible to them in a way he had not been before. Clark danced with her, which surprised everyone who witnessed it, including possibly Clark himself. He was not a natural dancer, but he was a precise mover, and he learned the patterns quickly and held her correctly, and looked at her over the space between them with an expression that the more observant people in the room found quite romantic. Hector Vane, watching from the side with a cup of punch, leaned over to Sam Whitmore and said quietly, "You remember when he nearly dropped the salt?" "Never going to forget it," Sam said. "Look at him now," Hector said. Sam looked. Clark was turning Susanna through the final steps of a waltz, and she was laughing at something he had said, and his face was entirely open in a way none of them had ever seen. Sam nodded slowly. "That woman did something to him," he said. "Something good," Hector said firmly. The spring came in with the particular violence and beauty of the Kansas plains thunderstorms that rolled across the sky like armies, followed by mornings of such crystalline clarity that the whole world seemed newly made. The cattle woke from their winter lethargy, and the grass came green, and the work of the land resumed in earnest. Susanna and Clark were engaged by April. He had proposed one evening in March, not in any grand location or elaborate circumstance, but sitting on the front steps of the Boone house in the early dark, with the first frogs of spring calling from the stream in the distance and the smell of new grass in the air. He had not made a speech. He had turned to her and said, with his characteristic directness that was also its own kind of elegance, "I want to spend my life with you, Susanna. Will you marry me?" And she had said yes with a completeness and certainty that she had never felt about anything she had not chosen, but that she felt about this the way she felt about the land and the work, and everything she had built with her own two hands utterly, clearly, right. He put a ring on her finger that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, a small sapphire set in worked gold that was simple and lovely, and had cost him 2 months' foreman's wages, which she only found out much later, and which moved her considerably when she did. The engagement was the talk of Caldwell for approximately 2 weeks, after which it became simply an accepted fact, the way the town accepted most things, with a short period of interest followed by the practical absorption of new information into the ongoing texture of daily life. The ranch hands at the rocking however, treated it with a degree of subdued celebration that was touching. Ramon made a special supper. Hector Vane, on behalf of the bunkhouse, presented Clark with a new pair of leather riding gloves and a card signed by everyone that said, in Hector's careful handwriting, "Congratulations, boss. She's the best thing that ever happened to this ranch." Clark read this, standing in the cookhouse, and said nothing for a moment. Then he folded the card and put it in his shirt pocket and said, "Thank you, Hector." His voice was rough around the edges in a way that Hector pretended not to notice out of respect. They were married in June, exactly 1 year after Susanna Boone had driven into Caldwell on a buckboard wagon beside her father. The ceremony was held outside, on the open ground between the Boone house and the first rise of the northern pasture, because neither of them wanted to be inside on a day that beautiful. The sky was the deep summer blue of Kansas in its best season. The prairie grass moved in a steady, warm wind. Ramon cooked for 40 people. Amos Boone cried, which he claimed was on account of the wind in his eyes, and everyone present tactfully agreed. Clark stood at the front of the gathered people in his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and revealed that he was, beneath the trail dust and work clothes, a considerably handsome man, and watched Susanna walk toward him across the grass in a white dress she had made herself over the winter, a practical woman's approach to a wedding dress, entirely sensible and entirely beautiful. She walked without ceremony, directly, the way she walked toward everything, and when she reached him she looked up at him with those brown eyes that had been looking at him straight and clear since the first evening she asked him to pass the salt, and he thought that he had never in his life been as certain of anything as he was of the value of this moment. The minister spoke the words and they repeated them back, and when the minister said Clark might kiss his bride, Clark took Susanna's face in his hands with that exquisite, particular gentleness that was the private counterpart to all his public capability, and kissed her while 40 people cheered and the Kansas wind moved through the summer grass. Amos Boone dabbed at his eyes with his handkerchief. "Wind," he said firmly, to no one in particular. The first years of their marriage were full. They managed both properties, the Boone land, which became officially the Ellsworth Boone Ranch, and Clark's ongoing work as foreman of the Rocking E, a position he held for 3 more years until Gerald Hargrove, in a moment of unusual clarity that may or may not have been related to his deteriorating health, offered Clark the opportunity to purchase a portion of the Rocking E's land at a fair price. Clark and Susanna sat at the kitchen table of what was now their house on the Ellsworth Boone property and spread the map out and looked at it together, the way they made all their significant decisions, as partners, both of them looking at the same information, both voices equal. "It's a lot," Susanna said. She was not saying it was too much, she was measuring. "The northern section would connect our land to the Rocking E's best water source," Clark said, tracing the map with one finger. "And Hargrove is selling at a price he set low because he wants it settled quickly." "His health is going," Susanna said quietly. "Yes," Clark said. He was matter-of-fact about it, but there was underneath it the kind of respect a man gives to an employer who has treated him fairly, even an employer as absent and flawed as Hargrove had been. "Then yes," Susanna said, "we make the offer." They made the offer. It was accepted. The northern section of the Rocking E became part of their land, and Clark left Hargrove's employ amicably, with handshakes and genuine mutual respect, to manage their own operation full-time. The Ellsworth Ranch, as it came to be known, covered just over 3,000 acres by 1882, ran quality longhorns, and was regarded as one of the better-managed operations in the territory, a reputation built on the combined qualities of its 2 owners, his knowledge of the land and the cattle, and her organizational intelligence and instinct for relationships, for the human side of a business that was, in the end, always also human. Amos Boone lived with them on the ranch. He had aged as men age who have worked hard and lost a beloved companion a little slower, a little quieter, but still useful and still himself. He had an enormous affection for Clark that was partly the affection of a father-in-law who approves of his daughter's choice, and partly something more direct, a genuine pleasure in the company of a man he found admirable and interesting. They played chess in the evenings when Susanna was busy with the accounts, and their games were long and contested, and accompanied by an ongoing low-level argument about cattle management philosophy that both of them enjoyed enormously. In the spring of 1882, Susanna told Clark she was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning over breakfast, sitting across the table from him the way they had sat across the table from each other at that first supper in the cookhouse almost 4 years before. She said it plainly, directly, the way she said most things. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her. And on his face was an expression that combined every complicated, powerful, layered thing he had spent his adult life not showing the world, made suddenly and entirely visible. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Susanna," he said, which was all he said, but the way he said her name made it enough. Their son was born in October of 1882 on a cool, clear morning, when the sky was the same October blue it had been on the first day of that first cattle drive. They named him James Amos Ellsworth James for Clark's father, who had died when Clark was 16, and Amos for the grandfather who sat in the kitchen in the early morning and was told the news by his daughter with shining eyes, and who did not, this time, attribute his emotional response to the wind, because they were inside and there was no wind, and he had stopped pretending. James was a serious, curious child who inherited his father's stillness and his mother's directness, and who would, by the time he was 3 years old, follow Clark around the ranch on his small, determined legs with an intensity of purpose that made the hands affectionately refer to him as the little foreman. Hector Vane, who had married a Caldwell girl named Rosa in 1881 and was now a fixture of the Ellsworth ranch as a senior hand, taught James his first knot at age 2.5 and was enormously proud of this accomplishment. The years settled into the good rhythms of a life well built. The work was constant and sometimes hard and always meaningful. There were lean seasons and good seasons, and the particular drama of weather and cattle and land that is the ongoing texture of ranch life. There was a dispute with a neighboring landowner over water rights in 1883 that Clark handled with the same quiet, intractable competence he applied to all things, not with the pistol on his hip, which was mostly decorative by this point in the settled territory, but with documentation and a steady refusal to accept an unfair outcome. And the dispute was resolved in their favor, and they planted a new stand of cottonwood trees along the disputed creek bank to mark the resolution, which Susanna said was her favorite thing anyone had ever done in a legal dispute. There was a difficult winter in 1884 when 3 weeks of cold beyond anything. The territory normally delivered killed 12 head of cattle and drove the temperature so low that the water in the kitchen basin froze overnight. Clark and the hands worked brutal hours to protect the herd and the infrastructure, and Susanna worked alongside them and kept the cookhouse running and the men fed. And there were 2 nights during that stretch when she and Clark were so exhausted that they fell asleep at the kitchen table before either of them had finished eating. And she woke at 2 in the morning with her head on her arms, and found that he had put a blanket over her shoulders before falling asleep himself at the other end of the table. And she sat in the cold kitchen in the dark and looked at this sleeping man who was her husband and her partner and her home, and felt a love for him so complete and solid that it was almost physical, like the weight of the good blanket on her shoulders. There was joy, too, and plenty of it, the particular daily joy of a life that is exactly what you want it to be. The summer evenings when the work was done and they sat on the front step of the house together, talking or not talking, and the prairie stretched wide and quiet in every direction, and the sky went through its evening repertoire of color. The way he still, after years of marriage and thousands of shared meals, would sometimes reach for something she handed him with a slight, careful attention that reminded her of the salt cellar and the dinner table and everything that had started there. She told him once that she still thought about that, the fumble, the recovery, the expression on his face. He shook his head. "I will never live that down," he said, but he was smiling. "You shouldn't try to," she said. "It's my favorite thing that ever happened at a dinner table." He looked at her. "Your favorite thing? It told me everything I needed to know about you," she said. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "What did it tell you?" "That you were capable of being surprised," she said. That somewhere under all that composure there was a person who could be caught off guard by something simple. She paused. "I liked knowing that. It made you real." He was quiet for another moment, and then he said, "You made me real," which was the most direct and personal and important thing he had ever said to her, and she felt it land the way true things land, not loudly, but with a weight that stays. Their second child was born in 1885, a daughter they named Clara Mee, who arrived in the spring with a full head of dark hair like her mother and her father's gray-blue eyes, and who was from the first moments of her life the loudest and most opinionated member of the household, which, considering her mother, was a meaningful statement. James, who was nearly 3, regarded his new sister with an initial suspicion that converted within a week to a fierce, protective devotion that would remain unchanged for the rest of his life. Amos Boone was 62 and slower now, but he held Clara the day she was born with the steady, careful hands of a man who has handled fragile and precious things, and his face had an expression of such pure, uncomplicated happiness that Clark, standing in the doorway, turned to look at the wall for a moment in the way of a man managing something that had gotten bigger than he expected. The years between 1885 and 1888 were the years of the Ellsworth ranch's full flowering. The operation was sound and growing, not through any spectacular event but through the steady accumulation of good decisions, hard work, and the kind of reputation that builds itself on consistent quality. Their cattle were good. Their land was well managed. Their hands were fairly paid and well treated and stayed, which in that industry and time was its own distinction. Hector Vane became their foreman, a full turning of the circle from the young hand who had watched Clark fumble the salt cellar in astonishment, and he ran the daily work with a capability that Clark trusted completely. Pete Garza retired in 1887, and they threw him a party that involved Ramon cooking for 2 days and every person who had ever worked on the ranch or the neighboring ones in attendance. And Pete, confronted with this entire gathering of affectionate people, stood in the yard and looked around at all of them with the expression of a man who did not have words, and therefore communicated his feelings through the quality of his presence, which was very good indeed. Ramon did not retire. He indicated, when the subject arose, that he expected to be cooking for the Ellsworth household until one or the other of them was unable to perform the function, and this would not be him. He cooked James his first birthday cake and Clara's too, and continued to cook Sunday suppers that were the occasion for everyone connected to the ranch to gather and eat together, a tradition that had started in the old Rocking Cookhouse and had migrated to the Ellsworth house and showed no signs of ending. Caldwell itself changed in these years, as the frontier towns all changed, becoming more settled, more permanent, acquiring the appurtenances of a town that expected to be there in 50 years. A school was built in 1883, and Susanna was one of the citizens who worked to establish and fund it, because she believed the same thing her mother had believed, that the most important thing you could give a young person in this country was the means to understand it. James attended when he was old enough, walking the 3 miles to town with the steady, unhurried stride of his father, and came home with books and questions and the kind of energy that only reading generates. She had watched what the railroad and the cattle trade meant to the Apache and the Osage and the other peoples whose land this had been, and whose lives had been fundamentally altered by the presence of the American cattle industry and the settlers who supported it. This was something she thought about with a discomfort that honest people feel when prosperity is accompanied by someone else's loss, and she spoke of it to Clark one evening when the subject arose, a dispute in the territorial papers about land allocation that touched the edges of these deeper questions. Clark was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said, which was what a man says when he has been carrying the same weight and has no easy answer to offer. "We're here. We've built here. I'm not sure there's a way to undo what's already been done." He paused. "But I think there's a way to do what's in front of you with more honesty than most people manage." They talked about what that meant in practical terms, the kind of conversation that doesn't resolve everything, but that insists on keeping the question alive rather than burying it under the convenience of not looking. She respected him enormously for the quality of his honesty in those conversations, for the refusal to pretend that comfort didn't sometimes come at a cost that others paid. By 1888, Clark was 39 years old and Susanna was 34, and the life they had built together was everything that life on the frontier could be at its best: purposeful, connected to the land, honest in its demands and honest in its rewards. The children were growing into themselves with the particular clarity of children who have been loved well and worked alongside and taken seriously. James at 6 was thoughtful and capable and had his father's quiet precision. Clara at 3 was fierce and funny and had inherited, it seemed, a combination of both her parents that produced something entirely her own. One evening in late summer, Clark came in from the back pasture and found Susanna standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard where James and Clara were playing, James carefully demonstrating something to his small sister, who was following his instructions with her characteristic mix of concentration and skepticism. Susanna did not hear Clark come in, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her watching them. She turned, sensing him, and found him there. "Long day?" she asked. "Good day," he said. He came across the kitchen and stood beside her at the window. Outside, James had apparently explained whatever he was trying to explain, and Clara had approved it, and they were now doing it together. "Look at them," he said quietly. "I know," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the window together in the warm kitchen with the last of the summer light coming in, and watched their children play. The prairie stretched behind the yard in its evening colors, the gold of the dry grass, the blue of the far sky, the long shadows of the cottonwood trees along the creek. "Do you remember," Clark said, "when you asked me to pass the salt?" She laughed quietly against his shoulder. "I'll always remember it. I've spent 10 years trying to figure out how to explain what happened in that moment," he said, and she asked. "I think it was the first time in years that anyone looked at me like I was just a person," he said. "Not the foreman, not whatever it is people say about me, just a person sitting at a table." A pause. "You looked at me like I was someone ordinary." "You were never ordinary," she said. "I know." But the looking was ordinary, the asking was ordinary. He was quiet for a moment. "I had forgotten a little what that felt like." She turned to look up at him. The afternoon light was in his face, and she could see, as she could always see now, everything that had been under the composure from the beginning, the depth of him, the care of him, the particular irreplaceable person who had nearly dropped a salt cellar in front of a table full of ranch hands because a woman with brown eyes had seen him clearly. "I'm glad I asked," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I can properly say." She reached up and touched his face with her hand, the way she had touched him 1,000 times and would touch him 1,000 more, and he turned into the touch the way he always did, with that same particular quality of openness that was only hers to see. The children came in from the yard, Clara announcing her hunger in no uncertain terms, and James explaining to her that supper would not be earlier for her complaining, which was such a precise reproduction of something both his parents had told him that Susanna buried her face in Clark's shoulder to keep from laughing. Clark disentangled himself from his wife with genuine reluctance and crouched down to receive Clara, who launched herself at him with the full-body confidence of a child who has never doubted that she will be caught. He caught her, of course, steadily, easily, with all the capability of his large and gentle hands. James stood at his other side, and Clark pulled him in too, and Susanna looked at the three of them in the kitchen light and thought that she had been right. The night she sat on the front step in her first months in the territory and looked at the wide prairie sky and thought about home. Home was built, not found built, board by board, acre by acre, conversation by conversation. Built from a salt cellar and a clear-eyed look, and the slow, honest revelation of two people who had each been waiting, without entirely knowing it, for someone who would see them plainly. Ramon came through the kitchen door with the supper, and began moving them all toward the table with the good-natured efficiency of a man who has been feeding people he loves for a very long time and sees no reason to stop. They sat down to supper, Susanna and Clark and James and Clara, and Amos at the end of the table, with the contentment of a man who has seen his daughter well loved and built something good in the world, and the warm light of the lamps, and the smell of Ramon's cooking, and outside the window the prairie enormous and beautiful in the darkening evening, and all of it, every acre, every person, every meal and conversation and morning and hard day and good day, utterly, completely, gratefully theirs. The salt cellar was in the middle of the table as it always was. Clark reached for it without hesitation, without the slightest tremor, with perfect steadiness, and passed it to his wife. She took it with a smile that had not changed in 10 years, direct and warm and entirely real, and salted her supper and set it back down between them. "Thank you," she said. "Always," he said, and meant it down to the marrow of his bones.